Alright, this video is for Windows users only, in which we will introduce you to the Windows subsystems for Linux, which we're also going to learn how to install and configure over the next span of the next few videos. It is a little bit tricky, and it's probably one of the trickiest installations of the entire course. Now, it may look a bit overwhelming for beginners. That is okay. But if you're on a Windows machine, it's also something that can help you avoid splashing money into a new laptop. It is a very useful tool if you don't have a MacBook handy, or at the moment, buying a MacBook is not really an option for you. Now, some warnings aside, WSL provides an alternative to learning Unix terminal commands, and an alternative to dual booting, for example, Windows and Ubuntu on the same partition. It is aimed at more advanced users, but as with everything in this course, a nice and steady approach is the key to learning new things. So what is this Windows subsystem for Linux, in other words, WSL? Before we answer that, why don't we talk about why we even need something like it and go a little bit into the computer history very quickly with the general overview. Both Mac OS and Linux have a common ancestor, Unix. Here's a bit of a comparison, courtesy some of my old classmates from years ago. He's very opinionated, but that's okay. So what we see here is between Mac and Linux, here he's using Ubuntu Linux, one of the Linux distributions, as a comparison. The kernel, basically the things that make the operating system run, they both inherit from Unix. They both use the same shell. Technically, new Macs use SSH. It's a newer version of Bash, but they both support Bash. And his very opinionated example is that both Mac and OS manage system resources very well, but Windows 10, I guess 11 now, has poor resource management. That is, of course, an opinion, but the actual facts here, the non-disputable facts, is that both macOS and all of the Linux distributions, they inherit from the same Unix kernel and they use the same shell. Meaning what? Meaning that they have almost the same, basically the same terminal commands. They have very similar file structure, and they share the same ancestor, the same essentially Unix cousin. What does that mean in the development world? In the web development world, lots of these tools that we will need to use, build tools, lots of the other dev tools such as MongoDB, or let's say Node and NPM, or PSQL and PSQL Server, they are built for Mac and Linux first, and Windows second. Some of the tools don't even support Windows, meaning you can get them to run on Windows, just on bare bones Windows, but you're going to run into many problems. So that is possible to do, but you're definitely going to be swimming upstream here. You're definitely going to be running into more problems. And when we learn these commands, when we learn these terminal commands and learn how to use these tools, you're going to be out of sync with the rest of the course, because it expects to either have a macOS system and a macOS terminal, or an Ubuntu system and the Ubuntu terminal. Now, Windows by default has its own terminal, right? So we can open up the command prompt and we have it here. But the Windows terminal versus a Mac or Linux terminal, they're not at all the same. They don't even use the same commands. In fact, if we go back here and we look at the basic Unix commands, which are common with Mac and Linux systems, they're not supported. They're not supported within Windows terminal. So for example, if, and I do have already WSL configured here. So if I go here and I do a command like, let's say, pwd or ls or anything like that, I get certain output. If I try to do something as a super user, I get certain output. Now let's go back to the Windows terminal and try the same thing again. All right, pwd, no luck, ls, no luck again. I don't know, touch, no luck again, right? Because by default, Windows has, again, its own ancestor that is different from Mac and Linux. Now, again, it is possible. It is possible to have Windows set up the Windows terminal to accept these commands, but once again, that is not something that we need to be doing, because even if you set up the Windows terminal to accept these commands, you will still be trying to install tools that were built for Mac and Ubuntu Linux first. You're going to be trying to install this on Windows, which is just not going to work for you. Moreover, I can make almost a certain guarantee in my 10+ years of programming experience, from interning at Airbnb, later working in the corporate environment, later working with smaller startups, corporate environment again, a smaller startup again. You will either be working in a Mac or within a Linux environment, if you choose to do so, if you want to have more control. Now, some smaller startups, they won't stop you from working within an exclusively Windows environment at your own risk. If you want to do it, you can. But in many cases, with a more corporate environment, your team lead might issue a MacBook for work only, so that everyone is in the same tool. Point here being, it's not really an option to learn the Unix commands and the Unix file structure in the dev world. It is pretty much a requirement. And remember, Mac and Linux have their common ancestor. So whatever you learn on Linux, you can still use on a Mac later down the road. And what exactly is a WSL? It stands for Windows Subsystem for Linux. Let's go in here in some Microsoft descriptions. What it is, it's a program. It's a program that runs on Windows, and it allows us to run a Linux distribution or multiple Linux distributions within our own Windows operating system. Linux is probably a operating system, you've probably heard of it. You've seen the penguin logo. It's very popular in the development world. Moreover, the web runs on Linux. If you Google how many servers in the world run Linux, it's going to be a ridiculous percentage. It's going to be something close to 80%, maybe more. There's not a single Linux operating system. There are many distributions. They're called distros for short. Debian, Kali, Red Hat, for example. The one that we are targeting is called Ubuntu, and we're going to be targeting a very specific version of Ubuntu. So again, WSL, Windows Subsystem, it will allow you to install a specific Linux distribution. It's not a virtual machine in a sense, not a traditional virtual machine, but it runs within the virtual machine environment. It uses virtualization technology. So essentially what will happen is the Windows will run WSL, and WSL will run a specific Linux distribution that you want to run. It will allow us to run Linux distribution within Windows and never leave the Windows operating system. We will still have access to our whole file system. It is going to be fairly fast. It's going to have a decent job at managing resources, and it's a viable alternative to setting up two different partitions on the hard drive and installing two different operating systems. and then choosing a specific operating system to boot when your laptop boots up. It does require some setup work. In fact, a lot of these manual installation steps seem very, very intimidating, but we'll go over that in the next video. If we go step by step and document each one of our steps, it can be done in about, I would say 15 minutes or less, maybe 20, if you just go step by step. In this case, we're going to be going slower, so it's going to take maybe more time. So set aside maybe half an hour, maybe an hour, so you can go slowly step by step. We're going to be using a specific Linux distribution, as I said, a specific version. Now, it's not going to be a graphical user interface, so it's not going to be like Windows like we have here. It's going to be a terminal. So it's just going to be a specific Linux terminal. I'll show this to you again right here. I have it set up. So you can actually input certain commands within a terminal, and these commands will execute. They will execute within the Windows, within the Ubuntu operating system. In fact, if I again do something like lsb release-a, this is showing to me that I'm running Ubuntu 22.04, release 22.04, and a code name Jammy, meaning that whenever I run something within this terminal, it's going to be executed within this Linux environment. For example, if I go to our Windows terminal and if I try to do something like node, nope, that's not going to work. Now, if I go to my Linux terminal and if I try to do same thing, it's like, oh look, welcome to node. I can write some Node.js JavaScript in the terminal. I can execute it. I can install the tools they would need. Everything within this specific kind of like controlled environment within its own file system. Very, very helpful. Again, very helpful if just going out and splashing a bunch of money on the MacBook is not really an option for you. Once you get this set up, it works. Now, in the next video might be a little bit painful, a little bit intimidating. I will try to explain a bit what I'm doing and when I'm running certain commands. But remember, this is not a course that is focused on low-level programming or in bash scripting. It is focused on web development. As long as we set these tools up and get them working, that's all we need for the scope of this course. And as I've said before, WSL is not really aimed at the beginners, but it's aimed as an alternative to a Mac or dual booting Windows and Ubuntu and setting up different hard drive partitions. But if we do it correctly, we will have a very powerful system right at our fingertips. So for example, here, like I have a bunch of starter codes, right? And it's running within the Linux environment, the Ubuntu Linux environment. And if I open this up here, and I can open it up within Windows, right? And look at this. I have Windows and I have a Ubuntu Linux running here, and I can access everything. I have access to the full Linux file system within Windows, right? But I also have access to the full Linux functionality here. Very powerful, and will take us through this course, and we'll be able to use all the tools in this course, again, if you're not on a Mac. So again, next video is going to be pretty intimidating, but don't worry, step by step, we'll go through it, and we'll go through this in a very structured manner. Don't you worry about that.